Welcome to Tokyo Wave, recorded in a live studio in Harajuku, Japan, with your hosts Aaron and Parker. All right, everyone, welcome to episode 35 of Tokyo Wave. We're your hosts, Aaron Randall
and Parker Allen. This week, we are joined by a special guest, Mark Davidson, former United States senior diplomat and director of government and external affairs for Amway Japan.
On Tokyo Wave, we bring you weekly updates from our studio in Harajuku.
Join us in segments featuring this week's top news,
political happenings,
business,
and other random stuff.
Here are this week's top news highlights.
Tokyo Governor Koike urges residents to eat and drink in small groups.
Japanese firms to promote common infrastructure for cashless payments.
Tokyo Olympics announces strict rules for athletes, including no partying and no hanging around.
Boo.
This week in Japan.
All right, let's get started with our top news item this week.
Tokyo Governor Koike urges residents to eat and drink in small groups.
The Associated Press has reported that Tokyo Governor Koike has urged for the public to cooperate in fighting the coronavirus as the city raised its alert to the highest level.
Speaking at a press conference on November 19th after meeting experts on Tokyo's coronavirus panel, Koike said that the city would secure more beds for patients and hotel rooms for those with less serious symptoms before infections climb further.
Koike told reporters, "We must stop further escalation of the infections, no matter what."
At the press conference, Koike held up a sign, as she often does, showing the kanji ko, which means small or short. She emphasized that everybody should observe the 5 kols when dining out or drinking. Meeting in small groups of 4 or less, using small plates to avoid sharing chopsticks or glasses, keeping dinner meetings to 1 hour or less, keeping a mask on in between eating or drinking, and speaking in a low voice.
Yeah, that sounds pretty much impossible. Koike said, "Your cooperation determines our fate. The key is not to have serious cases, and that's the red line."
Well, I guess no lockdown, huh?
Yeah, that's something also echoed by the central government as well. But it does look like there are a lot of TV news reporting right now using this Google AI prediction tool. And you can see all of the predictions. They just shoot up.
Oh, wow.
And so there was a prediction in Tokyo that by mid-December, the numbers are going to be like twice or 3 times as bad as they are now. Scary stuff.
For sure. Up next, Japanese firms to promote common infrastructure for cashless payments.
Kyodo News has reported that more than 30 major companies in Japan will launch tests on a possible private digital currency from April 2021. The group of companies has created a new consortium to promote common infrastructure for interoperable cashless payment services.
The lack of interoperability between different cashless payment applications remains a hurdle both for consumers and retailers, as customers cannot use the payment app on their smartphone if a shop does not have a terminal that accepts it.
In June, Japan's 3 megabanks, that includes MUFG Bank, Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, and Mizuho Bank, together with railway operator East Japan Railway, the issuer of Suica IC cards, jointly set up a new group to explore possible interoperable infrastructure for cashless payments and digital currency.
This is hilarious. I mean, you know, when you go to Konbini now, I mean, how many different payment options are there?
And I mean, I think we were doing kind of okay until all of the QR code payment systems came in, the PayPay and the Pay by Pay and the I mean they all have these wacky names, and
yeah,
it's almost, you can see that these poor cashiers at these stores have no idea what they need to do.
Oh yeah, it's a nightmare for them
to work with these obscure random systems, right?
Yeah. I usually have to say it's a credit card a couple times for them to finally, oh, it's a credit card. Oh, okay. Because, you know, they're so used to so many different forms of payment.
It is interesting though, because I know up until recently, if you showed a credit card at a store or in a taxi or basically anywhere, they looked at you like you just killed their dog.
Oh yeah.
Like, you're not gonna make me do that. Ugh.
And got very angry. I've been chewed out by a couple taxi drivers before.
Literally, I mean,
So,
you get some pretty fierce opposition, but now it's like it's become the norm.
Yeah. I guess we can thank these cashless payment systems for that.
Hey, Aaron.
Yes.
Have a nice cashless. It's one of the slogans.
It is. You know, when I type PayPal on my iPhone, pay, it auto corrects to pay. I think pay must have paid Apple to do that.
paid Apple.
Yeah.
Up next, Tokyo Olympics announces strict rules for athletes, including no partying and no hanging around.
The Associated Press has reported that athletes at the Tokyo Olympics won't have the luxury of hanging around once they've wrapped up their events.
That means no late night parties in the athletes' village and no all-night drink-a-thons around town.
Olympic athletes will be encouraged to leave Japan a day or two after they finish competing.
Wow, this is some strict stuff.
Yeah, I was trying not to laugh while reading that line. Oh my gosh. That's nuts.
So, from the opening ceremony to life in the village on Tokyo Bay, the postponed 2020 Olympics will be like no other. The Olympic Committee has issued stringent rules and guidelines, and maybe vaccines and rapid testing as countermeasures in order to execute the games in the middle of a pandemic. John Coates, the IOC member in charge of overseeing Tokyo preparations, said at a briefing for the Olympics and Paralympics that staying longer in the village increases the potential for problems.
Coates confirmed that athletes would be discouraged from sightseeing or looking around the city.
So basically, they're in jail for a few days
and
nuts. Then shipped back in a music instrument box to their home country.
Man, I mean, especially for these athletes, anybody coming here, most people come here for a couple weeks, right? Go to Kyoto.
Well, and especially, I mean, these athletes, you know, they've been training for years, and they're finally going to, you know, show their stuff on the world stage. And after they're finished, I mean, it's notorious that these guys like to get absolutely wasted, party, and also apparently they like having sex afterwards.
I've heard about this. Yes.
You know, what is it? Every year some organization distributes like thousands of condoms. I wonder, maybe the condoms got canceled this year or next year. I guess those Olympic super babies are also canceled.
Man, would have been a good PR stunt for a condom company in Japan. The super condom.
Defy the Olympic order. Party hard. Durex. Coates accompanied International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach to Tokyo this week as he met Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga and shored up support with key Japanese sponsors.
It was Bach's first visit to Japan since the Olympics were postponed in March.
While in Tokyo, Bach said that he was confident a vaccine would be available in time for the Tokyo Olympics, and athletes would be strongly encouraged to take it. What are they gonna strap them down? Take the vaccine!
Well, according to some of my family who are doctors, that's what all the doctors are gonna have to do actually in the States.
It's that whole anti-vaccine movement.
Yeah, that too.
Well, we thought the coronavirus pandemic would last for 2 years, like the Spanish flu, but actually it's going to last forever. Isn't that great? Maybe they can just sew masks on top of our faces. Because some people don't want to take a vaccine.
Yeah, they've already got some pretty crazy helmet gear coming out. Probably you've seen, you know what I'm talking about, right? The slow motion helmet gear commercial.
It's going to be like playing a video game.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right, and coming up next, we have a special interview with Mark Davidson, a former United States senior diplomat and director of government and external affairs for Amway Japan.
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave.
Mark Davidson joined Amway in 2015 following 28 years as a Foreign Service officer with the United States Department of State. At Amway Japan, he oversees government and corporate affairs, media and public relations, corporate social responsibility, and regulatory policy.
As a diplomat, Mark served 4 times in Japan, including as U.S. Embassy Minister Counselor for Public Affairs. He also served diplomatic posts in Islamabad, Pakistan, Asuncion, Paraguay, Madrid, Spain, and Caracas, Venezuela.
You always get the hard ones.
I know, dude. I was like, fuck. Let me try to not murder these names.
Long way from Portland.
In Washington, at the direction of President Obama in 2010, Mark established the Interagency Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. Previously, he also served as Special Advisor for Asian Affairs to the U.S. House of Representatives International Relations Committee.
In 2008 and 2009, Mark managed the transition of the public diplomacy function of the State Department between the Bush and Obama administrations.
As a diplomat, Mark achieved the Senior Foreign Service rank of Minister Counselor. He also received the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award and the State Department's Superior Honor Award.
In 2014 and 2015, Mark taught U.S.-Japan relations and strategic leadership at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He has published numerous articles, columns, and book chapters on U.S. foreign policy.
Mark is currently Vice Chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan's Government Relations Committee and Co-Chair of the Education Committee. He also serves on numerous educational and charitable boards, including Temple University Japan, Hands-on Tokyo, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy's Asian Advisory Council.
Mark is fluent in Japanese, Spanish, and French, and holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a master's in law and diplomacy from the Tufts University Fletcher School.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on Tokyo Wave today.
Parker and Aaron, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes. So, Mark, usually when we have a guest on the first time, we really want to hear about their Japan story and what brought them to Japan. So maybe if you could indulge us on that.
Well, I think we all have our own long and winding road that brought us here. Perhaps mine is longer and more winding than many. I grew up and was educated in New England, which is just about as far away as you can possibly get from Japan and still be on planet Earth. I was very oriented toward Europe. I studied overseas in Europe when I was an undergraduate and also as a graduate student. But perhaps by a quirk of fate, or perhaps it was Providence, my roommate, my first year in graduate school, was Japanese. And through him, I met other Japanese graduate students in the Boston area and gradually became quite interested in the history of our relations, the bizarre psychological dependency that the U.S. and Japan have on one another. And I was led, in fact, to change my focus of studies from European studies to U.S.-Japan relations. Fortunately, I managed to do well enough so that I was invited to present my thesis at an academic conference in Japan and visited Japan for the first time at that point. Subsequently, when I entered the Foreign Service or the U.S. Diplomatic Service, I really wanted to learn Japanese well and to serve the United States and Japan. But of course, you can't predict the way that governments are going to work. So first they sent me to Latin America and then to Europe. But eventually the third time was lucky, and I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. So eventually I made my way here, and I was fortunate enough to spend more than half of my career as a career diplomat, either working in Japan or on Japan issues from Washington, D.C. When I was offered the opportunity to join the private sector about 5 years ago, one of the incentives that brought me here, of course, was the opportunity to come back to Japan, use a little bit of my experience and whatever passes as my skills, and contribute to a great company while living in Tokyo. So I took the decision to leave the government and parachute into the private sector.
Very cool. Yeah, that's really interesting, and it sounds like a lot of fun. I've heard about the foreign service. So even though you were living in different parts of the world, was Japan kind of your favorite, or did you catch kind of the Japan bug while you were here?
Yeah, well, I caught the Japan bug, I think, from my roommate. Not to go deep on the theme of infectious diseases today, yeah, I wound up, in fact, serving on 4 different occasions as a diplomat in Japan.
Oh, wow.
And on the day that I left the State Department in 2015, on that day, not in history, but on that day, I was, in fact, the U.S. Career diplomat with the longest service in Japan, about 12 years. It's somewhat unusual. Typically, if you're lucky, you may serve twice in the same embassy or same post, but to do it 4 times is somewhat unusual. Because one of the principles of the Foreign Service is that America's diplomats, our representatives, should be generalists. I liked to say it was one of the last great liberal arts professions. And that's why I also had the opportunity to serve in Latin America, in Europe, and also in South Asia, in Pakistan. So it was a good way to learn a lot about a lot of places in the world, but maybe not that deep. But I was fortunate because of my repeated service in Japan, I think, to go a little more deep than many diplomats have the opportunity to do so in a host society.
Very cool. Yeah, it sounds like a very exciting experience.
So switching gears, of course, you have experience in presidential transitions. And right now, the United States is headed into a presidential transition. You were involved in the transition from George W. Bush to President Obama. What was that experience like? And what do you think is happening right now with this current transition from President Trump to President-elect Biden?
Well, I was, in fact, yes, a career member of the State Department serving in Washington, D.C. at the time of the 2008 elections when President Obama was first elected. I was working for the Undersecretary for Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy in the headquarters of the State Department. And so I was one of the career people who was asked to prepare a smooth transition and ensure that the incoming Obama administration and its political appointees had the information and the orientation they needed so that on day one, they could keep the government functioning and moving forward under full steam. I think many analysts, in fact, today still consider that transition between the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration as the kind of model for smooth transitions. And the fact is that my experience of the Bush administration was that whether or not I was in agreement with their policies and direction, I think no one could question the general professionalism of the great majority of appointees in the Bush administration. I think there was a seriousness of purpose. I think there was an understanding of and devotion to the oath of office, which all political people and, in fact, foreign service officers take, which is to the U.S. Constitution. And so I think there was a genuine goodwill effort to ensure that the will of the people be respected and that the incoming Obama administration be set up for success. And so that involved, from the career official perspective, preparing briefing books and holding, for example, mock congressional hearings for the political appointees who had to go and defend themselves before the Senate to be confirmed. It involved keeping things going during the approximately 6 or 7 months during which there was no Undersecretary of State for Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy. There was no political appointee. We were waiting for the appointment and then for the confirmation hearings to be scheduled and then for the Senate to actually vote and for the individual to assume office. So we did the best we could as a career employees to keep things going, to ensure that our operations globally reflected the political will of the incoming president once he took the oath of office on January 20th, 2009, and basically ensure continuity of operations. So my experience was a positive one. We all worked extremely hard, but I think what is fundamental that I think we need to remind ourselves of. My experience was that, without exception, my colleagues in the career service were absolutely dedicated to their mission and their duty. Regardless of who's in power, the career part of the government, which has been, unfortunately, in recent years, derided as the so-called deep state. To some extent, the permanent government is absolutely dedicated to the most fundamental ideals of American democracy. Upholding the Constitution, serving the people to the best of their ability, and being transparent and open and honest. And if the will of the people changes and a new administration comes in from a different party, it's not a question of shifting allegiances. It's a question of simply remaining true to the duty to support your boss and respecting the democratically expressed will of the American people. Again, I'm speaking as an American now and as a former career official of the U.S. government who has not enjoyed the last 4 years of rhetoric decrying somehow that the so-called deep state is acting in opposition to the will of the people. Nothing could be further from the truth. So Republican or Democrat or anyone else, the 99.999% of career officials at any level in the U.S. government remain true to their oath of office, and that's true to the Constitution and the will of the people. I didn't mean to get on my soapbox right there, but I do think that needs to be said, because that was my
What is a very
experience.
cool soapbox. And I mean, I think this is really interesting background for our listeners, because I don't think a lot of people think about what goes into a presidential transition. And of course, right now we're in a bit of a fluctuating situation, because obviously, all of the media has called this election for President-elect Biden. We're calling President-elect Biden. And at the same time, though, there are, still undergoing, legal battles in various states. And there is a bit of question as to when President Trump will concede the election, if he does concede the election. And I would imagine this is also going to affect the transition process. What do you think is happening right now?
Absolutely. But let me just, as a little bit of background here, perhaps for your Japanese listeners who may not be entirely familiar with the U.S. system. Unlike parliamentary systems, either in Japan or, say, in Western Europe or even in Canada, an election in which parties change means a lot more than simply one leader changes. That's what we see. That's the most visible. That's what's on the TV news, right? But in the United States system, there are approximately 4,000 government officials from the cabinet level to to undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, and occasionally even down to the deputy assistant secretary level, which change from administration to administration. Of course, in Japan, for example, the LDP will vote for a new prime minister, and that person will take office, and the cabinet might change a little bit. A few of the very topmost people in some of the ministries will change, but by and large, the bureaucracy is not really impacted. But in the United States system, the reach of the political appointment system goes fairly deep. And of course, that also includes the most important embassies, such as the U.S. Embassy here in Tokyo, which goes invariably to a political appointee. Transition, that's a big thing to do. There's a lot of information that needs to be transferred, a lot of people who need to be briefed and brought up to speed on what their new jobs are going to be, to ensure that no balls are dropped and that America preserves its national security. And, for example, all too important today, that there is continuity and hopefully improvement in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so from that perspective, and speaking with no affiliation other than that of an American citizen living in Japan, it's somewhat appalling, frankly, to see the foot dragging and the refusal to accept or ascertain the reality of the situation, which is that overwhelmingly the American people voted for change in the White House and change in the executive branch of the U.S. government. So each day that the incoming Biden administration, President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Harris, and their staffers don't have access to the information and the support that they're entitled to from the White House and from the various branches of the executive of the administration is really imperiling the safety and security of the American people. So what's happening now, is unfortunately all too transparent, but it is, as Senator Romney of Utah actually said just a few minutes ago, it's unacceptable, it's un-American, and it's undemocratic, and it must stop.
On your point, kind of talking about safety of America and national security, I've read recently that the Bush v. Gore recount in 2000 is one of the things that led to the 2001 terrorist attacks, because the team didn't have enough time to be briefed on a lot of those classified materials.
Well, in fact, that's not just something you read. That was, in fact, the one of the chief conclusions of the official bipartisan 9/11 Commission that was set up in order to look in a nonpartisan, analytical way at what happened, and why did it happen, and most importantly, looking forward, how can we prevent it from happening again?
Right.
So, unfortunately, as a political system today, as we sit here, we are not heeding the very well documented conclusions of the 9/11 Commission, and I think it is a nonpartisan statement. It's a statement of fact that America's adversaries around the world and those who do not wish America well can only be satisfied by watching the resistance against accepting and implementing the will of the American people, overwhelmingly expressed in our November 3rd elections. I'll just note here that the 51% and climbing of popular vote that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris received is, in fact, the highest percentage of a vote that any presidential challenger has received in over 100 years, with the exception of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the depth of the Depression. It is almost unprecedented that a challenger, that is someone from the party outside the White House, would get 51% of the vote in a presidential election. So it is a, however you look at it, it is an overwhelming victory for the incoming president-elect and the vice president-elect. And the will of the American people could not be clearer.
Absolutely. Just one more question on this topic. In your opinion, what is the best case scenario looking to January? And also, what is the absolute worst case scenario? A lot of people are commenting now, Trump will not concede. He might try to hold things up in certain courts in certain states that can affect the actual electors. I wonder if you have any interesting thoughts or opinions on this.
So if I were still in government, what I would say now is I cannot comment on hypotheticals, but I'm out of government. But what I will say is that I'm confident, and I think the last 4 years have given me confidence that the basic democratic institutions of the United States are strong and will hold fast. But democracy is more than simply a list of rules or a constitution or a bunch of office buildings full of bureaucrats. Democracy also consists of norms and of traditions and frankly of comity, of goodwill, of a general sense that although you and I may disagree about certain details, we all are unified in trying to do what we believe is best for our country. And to some extent, those norms and that kind of consensus has been eroded. One can argue whether the Trump administration is a cause of that or a symptom of some deeper rifts within American society. I think the answer is all of the above. I think that the election of Donald Trump, as many have documented, is or was a symptom of a kind of distrust and a lack of confidence in the future among too many in American society. And this brought to the fore social problems that as a nation we failed to address adequately and will need to address going forward, no matter what happens within our politics. This is particularly, we see this in the more rural areas of the United States, of course, where the indicators of social well-being have taken a hit in recent years as the economy has changed, as basically it's not as easy as it once was to have only a high school degree and get a well-paying job. In fact, in most places, it's nearly impossible. As our economy has shifted from reliance on heavy industry and manufacturing, of course, to services, and as the kind of mega cities have really become the engines of our economic growth, the areas in the hinterland, the Chiho, as we'd say in Japan, have not been able to participate in the kind of prosperity generated by the very high-performing service industries, media, technology, and so forth that are concentrated on the coasts and the big cities. So these problems existed before the election of Trump. They have not been alleviated over the past 4 years, and they continue to exist. However, and again, this is not a partisan statement. I believe it's analytical, and it's based on the facts as I can ascertain them. It's unquestionable in my belief that President Trump and many of his enablers have exacerbated these problems. They've sought to use them, to ride them, to get political power, to rile up distrust in the system. The outgoing president has been fond of talking about his base, his people, and trying to use their anger and dissatisfaction to support his own power. And so a situation that was not ideal and that helped to lead into his surprise election 4 years ago has only become worse because rather than attempting to address the real social conditions of the people in the so-called red states or red counties, i.e. those that have supported the Republican Party, to a large extent, the president and the administration have only sought to exacerbate and use them to support their own aspirations for power. I don't mean to bring us to a downer.
No. This is the kind of commentary I definitely wanted to hear.
Let me also say, as a sometimes student of history, there is in fact a recurrent cycle in American history. About every 40 years or so, we go through a kind of political crisis. The worst in our history to date, and I hope ever, of course, was our Civil War in the middle of the 19th century, in which the political division between the slaveholding states and the free states of the North became too great, and the country was split in two, and it took the bloodiest war in American history to reunite the Union. But moving on 30 or 40 years from that, at the end of the Gilded Age, we had tremendous change as there was concentration of power and wealth in the big cities and a kind of populist revolt, almost a peaceful revolt, but a political revolt, in the populist movement, particularly in the Midwest, upper Midwest. We had the Great Depression 30 or 40 years on from that. In the 60s, of course, we had the civil rights. We had the anti-Vietnam, anti-war movement. We had riots in American cities as the civil rights movement. 100 years after America freed the slaves, we were reminded how far we had fallen from actually living out the promises of our Constitution to formerly enslaved people and their descendants in the United States. And now 40 years or so on from that, we're seeing politics scrambling to catch up with the kind of broader systemic changes in American economy and society as we adjust to the globalization of the American economy, as we adjust to rising levels of immigration, which I personally believe is nothing but a net plus for our country. It pains me to say this, a proportion of my fellow Americans don't see those changes in quite the same way. Politics are rushing to catch up with these broader changes. So, looked at over the span of almost 250 years of American existence as an independent country, I am optimistic. I am extraordinarily optimistic that we will get through this stress and strain. Had podcasts existed in 1968, and as toddlers, if we were doing this podcast, actually, you guys probably weren't even born yet, but we were talking to each other in 1968, we'd probably look around us and say, my gosh, the wheels are coming off of this thing. Not just the United States, but Western Europe and Japan, of course, as well. There was a high degree of civil unrest, yet we got through that, we moved through that, and we moved on, and we moved upward, and we moved to a better place. So I am at the end of the day, as engaged as I am, and as concerned as I am at the end of the day extraordinarily optimistic that the American system and American people will withstand this turbulence and move on. Winston Churchill supposedly said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that humans have tried from time to time throughout history. It is messy, it is noisy, it is frustrating, a little scary sometimes. But I believe that we will get through this, and we will learn from it and move on and move up.
Spoken as a true statesman, could only put it.
You're now listening to Tokyo Wave.
So, of course, after your quite long and successful career, I should say, in government service, you've transitioned into the private sector, and you're now leading government affairs for Amway Japan. What's it like to transition to the private sector after a career in government service?
Great question. Let me tell you, when I was contemplating strapping on the parachute and jumping out, I was pretty nervous, not knowing what I was jumping into. And perhaps that's because over the years, particularly in the United States, we have been subject to political rhetoric to the extent that, the government is ineffective, inefficient. The smart people, the effective people, the efficient people are in the private sector. We should do things more like the private sector does. So maybe I had an elevated image for what the private sector would be like. But let me say that the transition was much easier and smoother than I imagined it would be. Partially, it's because actually the company I work for is extraordinarily progressive, both with regard to the way it treats its employees, but also with regard to the contributions it seeks to make to society, helping people live healthier and more empowered lives. So there's a kind of mission behind it. But also just, kind of in terms of the day-to-day work, it's very, very similar to what I did in government. Of course, I was in the diplomatic service, which meant that every couple of years I was shifting from country to country, from language to language, learning on the fly to deal with meeting new people, mastering new problems and new issues, learning to eat new food, and speaking a different language. So the concept of change and adopting the change was something that I had learned, I think, over the years. But to a large extent, my work here, and our offices are in Shibuya, is very similar to what I did when I was at the U.S. Embassy in Akasaka. I go to work every day. Well, when I went to work every day, rather than working from home, my office is in a large building with an American flag flying out front. There are about 500 people working in the building. I oversee a multinational staff. I work on issues that involve bringing the United States and Japan closer together in a more cooperative, mutually beneficial way. I have to deal with issues of communicating and leading and inspiring people in multiple languages across cultures. So there's a lot of parallels in that regard. But the one thing I think that concerned me maybe more than anything else when I was contemplating making the jump was what I call the meaning factor. It may be a slightly tainted word these days, but when I think about what got me out of bed in the morning when I worked for the State Department, I think patriotism is one way to describe it. A sense that whatever I was doing on that day, to some extent, in some marginal way, I was representing or defending the interests of 330 million Americans. And there was a public service aspect to it that I found very gratifying. I did worry about that when I came into the private sector. But as I said earlier, one of the reasons I was attracted by the opportunity was that Amway in Japan and in the 100 markets around the world in which it operates globally is a company that's really dedicated to corporate citizenship. And a company that is actually founded, as hokey as it seems, on a kind of value system to really trying to contribute to society. Whether it is empowering the hundreds of thousands of Japanese who are our distributors, they distribute our products, and giving them a little side income, or through our kind of award-winning corporate social responsibility commitment to the people of Tohoku to help with their reconstruction. We've won a number of awards for not just the good work we've done, but the fact that we're still there now almost 10 years later, where many other companies have left. So that's a very gratifying part of my work, to feel I may not be representing 330 million Americans, but I am representing a company that sincerely wants to do good things in its society, not just for people who are involved with us, whether they be our employees or distributors, but the broader Japanese society as well too. So that, the meaning factor was something that in the end, it was a pretty good deal. I didn't lose that much by leaving government. I gained a lot by joining the private sector. And I will say just one more thing. What I do now is not amakudari. It is not the kind of typical pattern that we have seen traditionally in Japan, where a former government official parachutes in from heaven to a private sector sinecure. I hope my boss isn't listening when I say I work half as much and get paid twice as much as I did in government. What I mean by that is, and that is a joke, contrary to popular opinion, for 28 years, not just me, but everyone around me in the State Department and other agencies of the U.S. government present in an embassy. And in the embassy in Tokyo, there are about 25 different agencies of the government, not just state, present and with representatives there. People work darn hard. And I can tell you, it's not for the salary. It is for this meaning factor. It is for a sense of public service. And so I just like all your listeners to understand that if you are frustrated with what you consider to be dysfunction in American politics, look a level down and look to the career people and understand that there are hundreds of people at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and hundreds of thousands of career civil service and foreign service officers of the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere who sincerely work hard and they keep their eyes on their oath to the Constitution and working to advance the interests of the American people as they can best discern what those interests are. So again, I'll up on my soapbox, and I'm sorry about that, but that is just something I wanted to underscore.
No, thank you very much for that. It's especially, Aaron and I have never been in government service unless, Aaron, you've got some deep state ties that I don't know about.
Can't talk about that on this show right here.
I knew it. You've been to that Pizzagate place, haven't you, boy?
Signed too many NDAs to talk about that.
But, we've, truth be told, never done anything inside the government. So it always, I think people who don't have that experience, it really is a black box. We don't understand, what makes people inside the embassy and inside any of the branches of the United States government or any government for that matter. What makes them tick?
Well, as I said, I do think that the overwhelming majority of career government employees are motivated to get out of bed every day, as I was, by some sense that even in the smallest way, that your work matters and that it benefits your customers or clients, which are the 330 million fellow Americans whom you represent and work for. So I think that most people feel that, and that's the motivation that keeps the government moving forward, even through periods of political gridlock or occasional dysfunction at the highest levels.
No, wow, I think this is the first time we've got that kind of insight.
No, for sure. Yeah, it definitely, I have a sense of calmness hearing
what is
this.
that little tingly feeling? It's like, when's the last time I felt that American pride tingle? Yeah. I think it was 5 years ago. I think I want to eat a hamburger this evening.
No, so Mark, you also have experience working with President-elect Biden. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working with his team?
Yes. I don't want to overstate my relationship with the president-elect, but at one period in Washington, D.C., I, in fact, was in charge of White House liaison for the public diplomacy function of the State Department, which meant several meetings every week in, the Situation Room with obviously, there are interagency teams. I was part of the national security planning process at a low level, but always present in those rooms were members of the National Security Council and representatives of both President Obama's personal staff and the Vice President's staff. Subsequently, when I served as the counselor for public affairs in Islamabad, Pakistan, Vice President Biden did come visit us. I had a very difficult time in bilateral relations. I wrote his speech, and I was one of those who briefed the then vice president on the situation in Pakistan, and made recommendations as to not just what he should say, but how he should approach some of the very, very thorny policy issues at the time. And so I think those of us who watched the most recent campaign will know that part of the president-elect's selling point was that he's a nice guy, right? He's empathetic. He in a very real way feels our pain. Someone who has a unique story of personal tragedy and loss himself, presented himself during the campaign as someone who could understand what too many Americans are undergoing now during this period of pandemic, when people have lost loved ones and worry about their own jobs and livelihoods. But I can tell you, in that briefing room, in that secret part in the embassy, where no one could listen in, he was all business. He was, in the best possible sense, profane, in terms of showing that he had an absolute ability to hone in on the heart of the matter and to display the commitment and emotion necessary about some really thorny issues that we had with the Pakistani government at the time, to say, and I'll clean up his language, gosh darn it, I'm going to go into my meeting with the prime minister and I'm not going to take any prisoners. This was in the time leading up to the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and what exactly the vice president knew, and when he knew it, and what we knew that the Pakistanis knew, but they didn't know that we knew, but we knew that they know. I don't know. but the fact is that, in that briefing room, when I was sitting across the table from him, he displayed an absolutely acute sense of what American national interests are, and showed not the slightest hesitation in pursuing them in a forceful, direct manner. And for me, that's the kind of leader I'd like our nation to have. Someone who is empathetic, who knows from his own tragedy what others go through, is not narcissistic, but someone who knows what's important and is absolutely steely in his resolve to do the best he can for the American people. So that is the Joe Biden I saw in that secret briefing room in the heart of the embassy in Islamabad. And that's the Joe Biden who I believe will be the next president of the United States.
And he owns a Corvette.
He is wicked cool. When he puts those aviators on, man, it's like, I want to jump in with you.
Did you ever see the memes that circulated early in the Obama years of him outside shirtless washing his Trans Am?
I am a dedicated reader of The Onion. Uncle Joe from Scranton, he's a man of the people. And, one of the things I'm really looking forward to after January 20th, 2021 is the return of humor. I mean, not satire, but
or Schadenfreude.
But just a sense of humor to the White House. Return of culture. Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady-elect, of course, is a lifelong educator, and she's indicated she will continue carrying a full load as a professor at Northern Virginia Community College, which is out. I've actually lectured there before. It's a fabulous campus in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. It serves, by and large, a largely immigrant student body, Americans by choice, our fellow citizens who chose to join us and become an American, the people who will be our future as a country. And she's done this when her husband was a senator, when he was out of office, when he was vice president, and she's going to continue doing it. And to have a first couple like that in the White House, a couple that will emphasize arts, culture, education, and be able to laugh at themselves, is going to be like taking a hot ofuro on a cold day, just relaxing and a wonderful feeling of thank God Almighty.
Now you're making me wish it was snowing outside. So recently you were involved with supporting the Biden-Harris campaign in Asia. What was that experience like?
So yes, in full transparency, I was a member of the leadership of the Biden-Harris 2020 APAC team, Asia Pacific team. So what that boiled down to was essentially fundraising, or to use a slightly less polite term, perhaps bundling. Bringing other like-minded people together to contribute to the campaign. I am also honored that working through Democrats Abroad Japan, I played a very, 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 very tiny role in contributing to the Democratic campaign platform. Page 82, there is a paragraph on in the Biden-Harris administration, the United States will once again welcome foreign students to the U.S. with open arms. And so I was able to contribute to that conversation from Tokyo. During the campaign itself, the global, lockdown and the proliferation of digital connective technologies was a great aid to us, because what we were able to do was put together a series of virtual online fundraisers in which we would ask people who were interested to contribute a certain amount, in return for which they'd get a Zoom link, and we would link them up for an hour or more with some of the top advisors and future policymakers to the Biden first campaign, and of course now the incoming administration. We actually culminated with we worked our way up the chain with a number of people, particularly in the Biden foreign policy team, and we culminated with former Senator, former Secretary of State, and former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton just before the campaign. We were very successful. Again, this was an Asia-wide effort. And if I played some small part in maybe getting the financing or the funding for one TV commercial in Michigan or Arizona or Georgia, then I feel that, although I'm out of government service, maybe in this way I was able to continue some element of public service. So it was a very satisfying opportunity for me to get involved in something I couldn't do. Obviously, as a career employee of the government, all career employees of the government are very aware of the so-called Hatch Act, which is a U.S. law that prohibits any government employee from engaging in partisan political activity. And although it would appear that some members of the current Trump administration are unaware of the stipulations of that law, I can assure you that all of the career officials and officers of the U.S. government are very aware of that and do not participate in any public way in any partisan political activity.
Wow, I'm learning so many new things today.
Yeah, same here.
And so switching gears to U.S.-Japan relations, and of course, you are also someone who has been actively involved, and I would say continues to be deeply involved in U.S.-Japan relations. From that position, what do you think is the outlook for U.S.-Japan relations between Biden and Suga? Of course, traditionally speaking, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party is known to favor Republicans over Democrats. If you were advising the Suga administration, what would you tell them?
I would say, Prime Minister Suga, respectfully, sir, I would be very optimistic about the future of U.S.-Japan relations under the Biden administration. Parker, what you said, I'm afraid, is fairly accurate. For too long, too many in the Liberal Democratic Party have just assumed, without thinking it through, that Republicans are good for Japan and Democrats are bad for Japan. Again, with respect, I think this is a worldview that's outdated by about 30 or 40 years. Harkens back to the early days of trade friction between the U.S. and Japan in the 70s and the 80s, in which the Republicans were seen as being, free trade, and the Democrats are seen as being more protectionist and more.
There was that thing with the bashing of the radio on the steps of Congress. It was pretty bad.
There was a woman, a female member of Congress, whose name is unknown in the United States, but is known, I think, to all members of the Liberal Democratic Party, Helen Bentley, who did do, a smashing, I think, of a Toshiba radio. I think there was also a sledgehammer taken to a Japanese car on the steps of the Capitol, and that became emblematic of Japan bashing. But this is still the image, I think, that too many people in too many positions of responsibility have today in Tokyo. What I think is indisputable was that Prime Minister Abe and outgoing President Trump did have a certain degree of chemistry. They seemed to work together quite well and maybe even like one another. It's indisputable, I think, that they saw eye to eye, particularly with regard to the threat from China. And I'm someone who likes to be led by the facts. So I will give Trump administration its due. I think that they had have a pretty good fix on the threat that China represents, not just a military threat and an economic threat, but in a way a kind of cultural threat as a frankly authoritarian dictatorship that is attempting to hold itself up as an alternative model for development. So I think that will persist. I think that President-elect Biden and his advisors are all very clear-eyed about what is happening in Asia and what the stakes are. And for that very reason, I think, in fact, that there will be more emphasis in the Biden administration on the centrality of the U.S.-Japan alliance, not just in preserving America's interests, but in preserving the broader interests, the peace and security of the Indo-Pacific region writ large. And particularly, I think it's fair to say as well, and I'm not the only one who has observed this, that the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy, and by and large, was transactional. It was focused on deals, whether it be trade deals or security deals.
Beautiful deals.
Beautiful deals. The best.
Big deals.
Huge deals.
Made out of gold. Lots of gold.
I think it's glitter, not gold myself. An example of this, of course, was one of President Trump's first decisions in the White House, which is to walk away from TPP. And seek a series of bilateral trade agreements rather than multilateral or plurilateral trade regimes, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world as well. But I think the Biden administration is much more focused on multilateralism. And in a multilateral world, the kind of ironclad relationship and alliance the U.S. and Japan have, I think, looms even more important in the way America will approach the world. But during almost 30 years as a diplomat working largely on Japan, writing many speeches and giving many speeches myself, and one of the things we always cited traditionally was that the United States and Japan relationship is so strong, not because we share common interests, but because we share common values. And in the transactional approach to diplomacy that the Trump administration has taken, I think we've lost sight of the commonality of those values, not just in our rhetoric, but in the way we actually operate together on the world stage. And I can tell you, knowing many of the people who have President-elect Biden's ear, that human rights, democratic values, open societies, these will once again be central pillars of America's diplomatic engagement around the world. And as a great democratic nation, in fact, a model democratic nation for this region and even for the world, Japan and Prime Minister Suga and the Liberal Democratic Party should recognize this and understand that these are very, very positive indicators for the direction going forward. On a practical level, I think that an immediate benefit for Japan will be some reduction of the pressure that the Trump administration has placed on Japan with regard to host nation support for the 47,000 or so U.S. military personnel forward deployed to Japan. I can, for a while at least, as well, until the Biden administration gets its legs under it, I think there'll be some, at least temporary respite from pressure on trade as well. But again, I will give the Trump administration its due. Putting trade front and center in America's global engagement, I think, is something that's here to stay. I think it might have been a little overdue. So Japan is not out of the woods on trade, but I think that we will go back to a more traditional give and take of ideas and positions. More diplomacy and fewer tweets, which I think is probably a productive way to take care of and resolve the real trade differences that the U.S. and Japan still have. So net positive for Japan, positive for Prime Minister Suga, positive for the Liberal Democratic Party, and I think positive for the U.S. and Japan and the region.
Thank you very much for that. One thing that I think we can't really talk about U.S.-Japan relations without avoiding is the C word, China, China, China. And one of the criticisms I've heard of a potential Biden administration from political stakeholders in the Japanese government who remember the Obama years is that, want President-elect Biden echo a lot of those Obama-era China policies, which mainly it was a strategic patience, I think it was called, but a lot of criticism is now sort of lodged around that sort of Obama-era strategy of not so much, fisticuffs with China, of course, and that is very different from the current regime's very proactive and antagonistic approach of engagement with China, which, at least on the Japan side, has gotten quite positive reviews. But of course, President-elect Biden, President Obama are, while they worked together 4 years ago, are very different people. So what do you think the outlook is for the China policy of the Biden administration? And is it something that you think the people in the Japanese government, especially the LDP, would be happy with?
Parker, if I for a moment could take off my hat as a former diplomat, but also take off my hat as an international business person and put on the hat I used to wear as an academic. Let me give a little bit of a background to where I think we're going to go. When I was a professor on the faculty of the National War College, isn't that a great name, the College of War?
What do you study?
We study peace. Actually, you do study peace. It is part of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and it's a graduate program for the future leaders of our national security establishment, both military and civilian. These are the future generals and the future ambassadors who study at this fabulous institution. I was teaching U.S.-Japan relations, international affairs. And one of the fundamental texts we used is called the Thucydides Trap. It was an article and later a book by Harvard professor Graham Allison. Professor Allison and his research team looked back to the Peloponnesian War 2,500 years ago, Athens versus Sparta. And that was, of course, chronicled by Thucydides, the world's first great historian. And they looked at 16 examples when a rising power and a declining power clashed throughout 2,500 years of history. And of those 16 examples, on 12 occasions, it resulted in war, starting with Athens and Sparta and the Peloponnesian War. And the question that Graham Allison asked is, can the United States and China avoid the Thucydides trap? Interestingly and ironically, it has always been central to America's global engagement strategy since 1945 to be a declining power. In that it has been America's goal to raise up our allies. First, of course, from the destruction of World War II, and then, of course, through our overseas development assistance programs to developing countries around the world. Our goal has been to bring people up. The logical result of that is relative decline on the part of the United States. So this has been something that we've looked for. But the fact is that as the rest of the world has risen economically and politically, the United States has relatively declined in power, and China has been perhaps the most evident example of a country that has risen far and fast in recent decades. So here we have the classic case of a declining power and a rising power whose interests are in conflict. Can we avoid the Thucydides trap? Well, I can tell you, including some of the students I taught, Professor Allison and his book is kind of required reading among the foreign policy advisors to Joe Biden. So we went through a long twilight struggle of the Cold War against the former Soviet Union. It is a mistake to apply the template we used during that that long struggle to the new competition with China. But I think there are some similarities. But if we can put a negative at the heart of Biden administration foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, it is, first of all, to avoid a war. No one wants that. But that begs the question, of course, how do we do that? and preserve our interests and the interests of our allies, friends, and partners in the region. So I will give the Trump administration its due for putting China front and center in terms of our global engagement. However, I do more than quibble. I dissent from the erratic way in which the U.S. has sought to avoid the Thucydides trap under the current administration. I have high confidence that the Biden administration will not be, quote, soft on China. The Biden administration will be smart on China. And I think most fundamentally, rather than going it alone, the United States will understand that we are always stronger with our friends at our side. Our interests may not be 100% identical with those of Japan, but if you imagine the Venn diagram of international relations, there's a huge overlap between the circle of American interests and the circle of Japanese interests, and the circle of Australian interests, and the circle of Indian interests, and the circle of Vietnamese interests, and on throughout the region. I am convinced that not just Japan, Australia, and Singapore, but all the countries of the region really want America back. They want a strong American leadership presence in the region, whether it be diplomatic in the various regional summits and multilateral fora, whether it be economic in terms of American adherence potentially to some of the multilateral trade regimes that exist, in terms of our economic and development assistance, and just in terms of our, for lack of a more refined term, our moral leadership in standing up and saying that ethnic cleansing and genocide against Uyghurs is wrong. The destruction of the democratic institutions of Hong Kong against China's own pledged promises to the international community, it's wrong. Shutting off the internet so your own people are isolated behind the great firewall of China from the ebb and flow of information in the world, it's wrong. And I think an America that can stand up for not its values, but the common values of the democratic and progressive countries of the world is an America that will be better able to avoid an unintended conflict with China, and an America that will be welcomed by virtually every government and every nationality, I believe, in the Indo-Pacific region.
So I don't guess President-elect Biden's going to call it the Kung flu.
I would not go there. I find that personally extraordinarily offensive. And I think if there's one thing that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have stood for, unquestionably, it's for inclusion, it's for diversity, it's for tolerance, and to quote the immortal words of Michelle Obama, if they're going low, they're going to go high. They're going to go high.
Well, Mark, listening to your words, I think if there was a meter above my head that measured how proud I am to be an American, it's maxed out right now.
Well, that's kind of you to say, and I hope it's maxed out because, as I mentioned earlier, my sense is that our democratic institutions and our society is undergoing a trial. It's not over yet, but every indication is, we will not just survive, we will thrive. Let us hope with a stronger sense of just how rare and precious an achievement it is for us to have created and preserved a democratic system of government for almost 2.5 centuries. And the sacrifices that so many American men and women have made over the years in military service or in other ways to preserve, protect, and extend that democracy, we stand on the shoulders of giants, truly. Future historians will look back on the arc of the American presidency, and I think one of the great speeches that will ever reside in the pantheon of presidential speeches, Washington's farewell address, Lincoln's second inaugural, will be President Obama's own second inaugural address. He was very much a student of history, as was his speechwriter, and he saw echoes with the story of Abraham Lincoln and his own story, of course, as the first American president of African heritage to live in the White House. And in his second inaugural, he had this metaphor of these kind of expanding circles of liberty. from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. Seneca Falls, of course, being the 19th century convocation of women that led to the suffragette movement to expand the benefits of democracy beyond just property-holding white men to include women. Selma, of course, being that famous march with Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis across the Pettus Bridge, immortalized in the movie King, for civil rights and to expand the promise of our nation to our African-American fellow citizens. Stonewall, of course, being the demonstrations and riots that broke out in New York City when the police raided a gay bar in Greenwich Village, to expand the sense that all Americans, no matter who they love or what gender they adhere to, are fully members of our national family. President Obama had this sense of this expanding circle across history. And he liked to quote Martin Luther King by saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The road is winding, the road is rough, the road is a difficult one to trod, but we keep moving forward in the United States. We will pass through this period of trial. We will come out bruised and battered, but I believe stronger. And I believe adhering even more firmly to the institutions that have kept our democracy, if not quite the envy of the world, at least something that has, for all of its problems, reflected the will of the American people, bestowed legitimacy on our rulers, chosen by our people, and give us the chance to make this great experiment in multiracial, multicultural democracy work. If we can't do it in America, frankly, I'm quite concerned. We have this beautiful mosaic of people who've chosen to be Americans, and of course our Native American fellow citizens who've always been Americans. And immigrants get the job done. As the line from the fabulous musical Hamilton runs, immigrants, they get the job done. More than 50% of our Silicon Valley startups were founded by Americans by choice, immigrants. SpaceX, Elon Musk, South African by birth, American by conviction, and he and his genius and his company have just brought a Japanese astronaut Noguchi and others to the International Space Station, the first private space launch. Immigrants make America great, and it's hard. It's goes against some of the basest motivations that human beings have, but if we have a hope of making America America, it's our democracy that will enable us to do this, to ensure that everyone has a say, everyone's treated equally, everyone is respected, that we all know that Black lives matter. We need to say that. And this is an incredible moment. We're living through history. When we're studying history in the classroom, we think, oh, how interesting it must have been to live during French Revolution, the American Revolution, Civil War. Interesting, but darn confusing and darn hard. I think we're living through that kind of period today. But we will get through it, and we will go to a better place. And so that's my confidence and my optimism.
That was definitely the most impassioned defense of American democracy I think we've ever had on this program.
Yeah, I'm pretty emotional over here, to be honest with you.
It's that and those murder hornets. That's definitely the most American things we've had on the podcast. You know, they're farming those murder hornets in Washington.
Sounds like a conspiracy theory to me.
It's well, you should know you're in the deep state,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
Oh, jeez.
Well, so switching gears, of course, to a much less serious gear, somewhere in the maybe not the farther reaches, but the near reaches of the brain. Outside of your work, what do you do for fun? And also, we're very curious, you know, in the course of not just being a diplomat, but also working in the private sector, being very closely affiliated with U.S.-Japan relations, which behind closed doors ends up having some of the most hilarious moments in human history included in their annals of history. Do you have any funny anecdotes that you might be able to share with us?
Let's start with your first question first. I live in Japan for fun. By that, I mean I find tremendous satisfaction, amusement, intellectual stimulation by living in this fabulously interesting country. When people ask me, well, why have you spent so much of your life in Japan? I say, as a somewhat joking retort, I'm still trying to figure the place out, which I am. And I mean that from the place of deepest possible place of affection for this country, whether it be the food or the fabulous scenery, and of course, above all, the warm, gracious people of our host nation here. I love living in Japan and taking advantage of it as much as I can. Unfortunately, of course, with the pandemic and the work from home environment that many of us are in, I have not been able to get out and explore the back streets of Shitamachi or stroll up and down Omotesando as much as I used to do, enjoy the fabulous array of restaurants in Tokyo, or travel throughout this country as much as I used to enjoy doing. I like, fortunately, a kind of COVID-safe environment is the mountains. So particularly now in the beautiful fall weather, my wife and I like to go out hiking. Last weekend we were in Tama, climbing up some impossibly steep mountain. We spent 4 or 5 hours on the mountain, and I don't think we saw anyone else. 2 weeks ago, we actually I used GoTo Travel to go to Izu Oshima, and climbed up the volcano there. Again, fabulous fall weather. 5 hours on the volcano, we passed 2 or 3 other people. In Tokyo, you can be in this vast, extraordinarily scenic wilderness, enjoy that, and then come down from the mountain and eat the freshest sashimi and seafood at night. So I live in Japan for fun, and I feel very, very fortunate to be able to do that and take advantage of the wonderful, wonderful opportunities that this country and this fabulous city offer. Funny experiences. There are a couple that if I told you, I'd have to kill you, right? From the classified annals of U.S.-Japan relations. There are others that this is a family podcast. I probably can't repeat. But maybe I'll
I don't know. We say some pretty nasty stuff on here. Well, it's PG-13.
Yeah.
Well, Parker and Aaron, that's your own personal choice, and I respect your choice for that. But I'll take the high road. Let me approach it in this way. For the past 25 years, I've been married to the love of my life, who happens to be Japanese. And there's always, interest about, how did you meet your wife? And what's it like being married to a Japanese? I really don't like that line of questioning. She's an individual, she's a human being. I happen to spend a lot of my time in Japan as a young person, and it was time and opportunity, and she was the right person. So irrespective of nationality, we got married. And it's been humbling. And it is not just an emotional ride, it's an intellectual ride as well, too, to have a bicultural household. We've raised 2 beautiful daughters together. And it's really interesting, particularly in the areas of child raising. I always hesitate to go into the dark alley of kind of cultural reductionism. It's not, well, that's your culture and my culture. That's not the way it works. But I think there are some culturally informed different perspectives that we've had on education. But interestingly, there's some ways in which we're absolutely aligned. For example, my wife, even more than I, was much more strident in insisting that our girls need to go to an American university. My wife did not study in the United States, but I think she understood that relative to Japanese universities, the liberal arts approach of American universities was the best way to prepare, so shall we say, global citizens for the 21st century. But in other ways, particularly say discipline. I think my wife was more of, spare the rod and spoil the child. The father has to be disciplinarian and, lay down the law. I was more, kind of, but let's help her, our daughter, understand why she was wrong and make her own choice to make better choices next time. My wife's like, cut with that BS, send her up to her room, time out. So that was interesting in the different ways in which we approached a common strategic objective, which is to raise the best possible children. So not that everything is a metaphor for U.S.-Japan relations, country to country, but what's important in our bicultural relationship is to keep our eyes on the prize, which is our common goal and common interest as a family, and not let the ephemera, what's happening on the margins, distract us from what we're trying to do together as a family. So it's and I think useful for me, because I need to be metaphorically kicked in the shins every once in a while. It's helped keep me humble, because I will go into conversation sometimes absolutely convinced that I have a monopoly on truth and justice and right way of thinking, and we'll have a disagreement. And in the dark hours of the night, I'll realize, yeah, my wife was right and I was not. And so being in a kind of dual cultural household, I think, has helped keep me relatively humble. And reminded me that I don't have a monopoly on right ways of thinking, and that I need to remain open to different perspectives and different ways of looking at things.
What is that old saying? Not always right, but never wrong.
Well, that could also apply to diplomacy as well, too, right? we will agree to disagree and smile during the press conference.
Let's shake hands while almost, suffocating each other with a grip. What was that one? Was it Macron and Trump who had this death grip for 30 seconds?
It was Macron and Trump who had that death grip. And if you recall, it was Prime Minister Abe who, after his handshake, rolled his eyes and looked away. A clip which unfortunately wound up appearing in a number of Biden campaign commercials as well. But yes.
I have to say, I've seen our former Prime Minister Abe make some pretty funny faces, but nothing topped that one. He was, whoo. He looked like he thanked all of the gods for releasing him from that death grip.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And I think not only have you restored my faith in American democracy, but just your wealth of knowledge and expertise. It was so interesting to hear about your experiences.
Well, Aaron, that's very kind of you to say. And Aaron Parker, it's been an honor for me to talk with you. I've enjoyed it a great deal. And I'm really honored to have been invited to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Do you want to make any shout outs?
Love of my life, my wife, Kuniko, to my wonderful employer, Amway Japan, and maybe, just maybe, to the 80 million American people who voted for hope, who voted for President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, and to the many, many, many others who have worked very hard to preserve, protect, and defend our Constitution and our democratic institutions in the United States.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, listeners, that's right. You listener right there.
Who do you think should be our next guest on Tokyo Wave? Let us know. Drop us a line at wave@tokyowave.jp.
We hope you enjoyed Tokyo Wave.
If you haven't already, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube.
Join us again next week on Tokyo Wave.